My name is Carel Jansen. I am a practice director at Platformation in the security and trust domain. Today we're going to be talking about the Network and Information Security Directive, the NIS2 Directive, and the challenges that companies are facing at the moment and struggles that they have in complying with this new directive. But moreover, we're going to be talking also about the overarching theme, how to manage and balance risk management versus compliance. So what do companies need to do to move beyond compliance and to take a proactive, risk-based approach in truly becoming resilient? Today with me, my two special guests, Edwin Van Den Heuvel and Raymond Bierens.
Thank you to being here. My name is Edwin Van Den Heuvel, working for Tanium as a Director of Technical Account Management. And every day I speak about NIS2 and also DORA for the finance industry and what is compliance and what is risk.
Raymond Bierens from the Amsterdam Business Research Institute. I'm a Ph.D. researcher looking into the decision-making processes on digital risk, which of course is the main topic on the NIS2. Apart from that, chairman of the Connected Trust Foundation and a strategic advisor to several companies.
Great. Yeah. So thanks again for being here today, Edwin and Raymond. You were really excited to be talking to you. Of course, we see NIS2 as a bigger theme in the market. A lot of companies are struggling with, what do we need to do? How do we need to become compliant? But moreover, I think also that the theme that we want to be focusing on today, we see that NIS2 is also creating a business imperative actually to go beyond compliance. So going away from that checkbox exercise and moving into really more of a risk-based approach where security professionals together with their boards are making compelling business cases to move away from just becoming compliant and actually having a conversation about risk. So maybe that's also, let's say, the topic that I would want to address first. And Raymond, we've been talking about this already for a couple of times in the past. What can you say about this? What can you say about balancing out, let's say, being compliant versus managing risk?
Well, I think that the NIS2 is a kind of has a sense of duality in it. It is, if you would compare the NIS2 with the NIS1, it is more explicit in what does good look like for an organization who becomes the target audience of the NIS2. So in that sense, by being more specific, it drives organizations to become compliant first, risk resilient later. However, one of the measures is to do risk management. However, the NIS2 doesn't state what that actually is. So that can be managing the risk of non-compliance. It can also be the risk of managing against a cyber attack. And in that sense, that's the difficulty on the NIS2. Since it's a directive, we're still waiting for the Dutch government to produce its first draft of its legislation, how that actually will translate into the local regulation.
Yeah. So maybe Edwin, what's your experience here? What can you say about this? What do you see in the market?
Companies are struggling at the moment because it's a directive, what Raymond also already mentioned, and they don't know where to start. So what I see now is they are starting with assessments, people, process, technology, but they are confused because when you are a service provider, for example, they are thinking now, but what do I need to do add-ons on my services to be compliant? So everybody is struggling and finding a way to be NIS2 compliant for what it is, because we don't know yet for 100%. So we are in a transition, but a lot of questions still at a lot of companies in the public sector, but also in the commercial sector.
Yeah, right. So, and I think that's interesting. So, basically, actually, what we see, what I hear you saying, Raymond, and you as well, Edwin, is that companies are looking for kind of a benchmark. How do I determine what is good enough? Where do I start, and how do I ensure that I am meeting, let's say, I am managing my compliance risk, but perhaps more importantly, I'm also making sure that I am becoming resilient as an organization. So what else, what kind of advice could you give there, perhaps Raymond, to companies that you work with?
I think it's one of the challenges is that the NIS2 introduces a liability in addition to what was already there in the NIS1. But by introducing liability, you're introducing a whole new dynamic on litigation. Because when is something liable? And that's a very difficult determination actually to be made in court. So that makes it for an organization quite difficult to determine what's good enough. Good enough is not becoming liable. That's always the normal thing which you expect from an organization. The next step is when you could become liable is by being non-compliant. So what you see is in the NIS2 when it comes to regulation, for example, on notifying when an incident takes place, that's an easy one. That's very strict, that's very clear. It's within 24 hours or 48 hours you need to report an incident. But when is good enough for risk management? Is it enough when you do risk management, or is it enough? So when is it not good enough? For example, if you would have a Windows XP on a laptop with some antivirus product on it, would you then be non-compliant because you did risk management, you have an old device? In the market, we're considering that as a high-risk environment because you are really behind what's currently being expected. But you are doing risk management. So is that where the national regulation will say, well, when you do proper risk management, you need to have at least Windows 11 because 10 is no longer serviced? Or are you then in a different European frame where you go into the Cyber Resilience Act, which is another European act, not a directive, where Windows is being held responsible for updating it until a certain period. So it becomes a very difficult way, and what I see in large organizations, and that I find worrying, it is becoming an administrative burden because every act requires a show of compliance. But imagine in a very rare resources market that you have to have 3-4 people sometimes just on European and local regulations alone to understand what you and your supply chain responsibilities are. That makes it very difficult.
Yeah. And that's very interesting indeed, Raymond. And I think perhaps also looking at Edwin. So what we're hearing here, I think, is also how do we get a proper and a complete view on actually my risk exposure? Yeah. And what do we need to do there? In between the lines, what I'm hearing also is it's not just about doing risk management, but it's also about really quantifying, assessing risk, and then taking action upon, let's say, the risks that you consider intolerable as an organization. Yeah. And that sounds like, especially in a larger organization, sounds like could be potentially a very complex exercise because we're talking about vast landscapes. So maybe Edwin, what kind of thoughts do you have about that? What are things?
It sounds very simple, but it starts with visibility. What do I have? And it sounds very simple, but there's some research. In EMEA, companies in average does have 65% of visibility on their assets connected to the network. So that's a huge problem. Yeah? So this is the first thing. What do I have? Yeah? And it sounds simple, and I see now a lot of CMDB projects popping up, saying, yeah, we need to know what we have. And of course, that is important, but it's simple said than done. Yeah? Because companies have invested a lot in technology, but still there is a visibility gap. Yeah? So that's, I think, the first step to do. What do I have in my network? And then you can take the next steps. Then you can do some risk assessments, or you can do some compliance scans. Yeah? But if you have a gap of 35%, then one thing is sure, you are at risk.
Yeah, and one of the things I can really recommend to any both CISO or C-level executive who will become potentially liable, the name is actually quite dangerous. The the Directive on Network Information Security.
Yeah.
So what I would really recommend is if you go into the actual text of the directive, there is a definition of what's in scope. And that is different than the title says. The title says the Directive on Information Systems. The scope is all assets connected to your electronic communication network. So that's all assets, whether it's a smart lamp, a smart doorbell, or it's an IT system or a server. But the second is it's connected to the electronic communication network. And when you go and you have to go to another text because it refers to a different text, it shows it's everything connected to your network or all collective automated processing of the network. Yeah. So that means the scope is all assets in your organizations and potential clouds.
So that's actually, then we're talking not just IT, but also OT, IoT, of course.
Yes.
So that actually makes the scope quite vast, right? In terms of the asset classes that you need to protect.
Exactly.
On top of that, Raymond, if we talk about the dimensions people, process, technology, data, because information security management, cybersecurity management, by definition, requires a multidisciplinary approach, as we know. So what can you say about that in regards to NIS2? For instance, if we talk about situational awareness in a company, in an organization, what kind of recommendations can you do there?
This is exactly where you go into the topic in the beginning, risk management versus compliance. Situational awareness is not that's risk management. Being compliant just means making some inventory on your assets. But also compliance, and that makes sense given the speed in which technology evolves, is always on process. So if you make the distinction, process, technology, people, data, when you are compliant, you usually, when you look at ISO and IEC for OT, IEC 62443, I think it is, but that's primarily focused on the process. Are you able to report an incident, detect an incident? But when you look into people, the only thing which the NIS2 really says is you need to make sure your people are properly trained. Whether you're a C-level, then you get a different training than when you're a user. So you should do a phishing campaign or you should do something and the executive should make training. However, what I see the industry doing, and that's especially the industry which will benefit the most from the additional administrative burden on the auditing part, is that they are using the liability argument to get people going. But by doing that, they're trying to sort of educate their C-level into becoming a CISO. So when you talk about people, I see the biggest burden is that it shouldn't just be the executive becoming more technology savvy. It should also be the CISO becoming more able to speak the board language. So if you want to get a platform or you want to use Tanium, as a CISO, you shouldn't go with technical specifications to the C-level. You should go with a risk story. Well, generally, it's done very technically. So you get a very specific technical discussion, or you get a sort of tribe discussion. I'm in the open source tribe versus the commercial tribe. So you get this tribal discussion. But it's really rarely explained in a way that if you get a product, then on the assets and the mandatory scope of NIS2, this is what you should, this is why we need it, or this is what we're lacking. So it's not objective, it becomes a sort of technical discussion where you want the people discussion. They have the ability and liability to manage risk. This is what they need to manage their responsibility.
And that's actually very interesting. And Edwin and I were discussing before we had this session about an article that was published in the FD, in the Financial Dagblad, which basically, in summary, it stated that awareness of personal liability at CEO population is actually very low. So a study was done about, are CEOs aware of their personal liability, which is actually very low at the moment. And I think exactly as what you're saying, Raymond, and that's perhaps a question that I have. So what do we need to do? How do we equip and enable the CISOs of this world to start making these compelling, tangible business cases to their board levels, to speak the same language, and basically telling them, look, yes, you are compliant now, but with the current exposure that you are looking at, if you are unwilling, dear board members, to further invest in your cybersecurity program, this is your exposure. So at the moment, you have a big chance of, for instance, a ransomware attack. and make that, let's say, a conversation about potential impact, financial impact. So what are the things that we can still recommend there to the CISOs of this world? I'll ask first you, Raymond, and afterwards I'm also curious about Edwin, of course, and his view.
I think the main challenge is to get them engaged, basically, and I think it starts with information sharing, knowledge sharing. When you currently look at the structures we have in the Netherlands, for example, is very sector-driven, and they're limited in two ways. They're always limited in size, because if you make a group too big, whether it's C-level or CISOs, then the trust disappears because the group becomes anonymous. So you have to work with small groups in order to share knowledge and experiences on the cyber attack or something that happened, or you need support with. Simultaneously, if you look in the scope of the NIS2 in the Netherlands, which is currently estimated in the latest policy documents from the government, between 10 to 11,000 organizations, then you're seeing a target group of organizations which doesn't fit with the traditional way of working. And what we're seeing as Connect to Trust, like I said, I'm the chairman of the Connect to Trust Foundation, which is sharing across thousands of organizations in the Netherlands already, all quite mature. You see that it's a very difficult challenge to get information and to translate that into an action. So getting information is quite easy. You have to be careful that you're not getting too much. And generally you see when you get new threats, new risks, but then in policy risk terminology, you see people looking for information, whether for insurance purposes or whatever. They want to assess the chance and the impact of the risk. That's not something you can find easily. That's something you need to find amongst yourselves. So we need a different structure to actually get this going. And we find that the majority of the attention is now going towards, do I get all the information from my own technology as well as from my ecosystem, my network, my government, to assess the risk? What they're not aware is that what we find in our experience as a foundation, and that's confirmed by my own research in Amsterdam, is that the challenge is not getting information. The challenge is processing information in order to have proper, timely action taken within your organization or your supply chain.
So what I'm actually also hearing you say is there is that information, that wealth of information basically from a lot of sources, external sources. And we need to be able, as organizations, the big challenge is actually in translating that information and kind of mapping it onto their own organization to better understand, for instance, vulnerabilities and the potential impact of those vulnerabilities across the IT, OT, IoT landscape in the company. Maybe something, what can you say about that, Edwin? What kind of, let's say, instruments, methodologies do we need as a baseline to start to quickly, let's say, assess the landscape?
Yeah, so one step back, the role of the CISO. Is the CISO part of the board or is he reporting to the CIO? I think that makes a big difference, because the CISO can translate, if you just have the right tools, to the board, saying what is the risk to your revenue. Very simplified, when it's a commercial business is. So that's one. So security, mostly a separate department, somewhere next to IT. And I think the first thing to do is create real SecOps. Security is part of your operations and you need to be part of the board. Simple. But that is a journey, because we saw DevOps many years ago, development, operations, they had to work together. It took 20 years. So time is a thing. That's one. Secondly, you need contextual information. So what Raymond is mentioning, data collecting is easy, but translate that board understands what it is, and then you have the action part. And for action, you need the right tooling landscape to execute. Yeah? And that is not point solutions, because I think historically every company bought point solutions for every problem, so they have a bunch of tools, but then you have to go to platforms to oversee what's happening, and also to take action. And take action, from my world, it's direct action and not execute, fire and forget, and hopefully it happens. But it's right information, take action, and that brings it together. And then you need strategic platforms. So that is supporting the dashboards you need for board level and make it tangible. So if you speak about compliance, have a compliance dashboard. Is it about risk? Create a risk dashboard. Not mingle them, because then it is confusing. Compliance and a risk, and what is because board wants to steer a company, and don't want to have the nitty-gritty details. That is the role of a CISO or the security team behind him.
So I hear you say indeed, Edwin, context is very, very important. So if we consider a particular vulnerability on an asset, we need to understand, how does that asset, how is it integrated into the landscape, into the ecosystem, to really understand business impact. Because if it's an asset that's supporting critical process, then considered, let's say, minor vulnerability may still pose a bigger risk. So I think I hear you say indeed that context is super important. Another component that I heard you say in between the lines is also taking action, taking remediative action, and that requires multidisciplinary collaboration. So it's not just security; it's also IT. And in order to assess risk, we need the business, because in the end, the business determines, how critical is my business process or whatever. So I think in that sense also, working with a platform strategy where we are able to easily connect, different teams, different people across the organization is actually fundamentally important to support a highly effective cyber program, and with that, create a resilient organization. How do you see this, Raymond? If we talk about, let's say, supporting technology and data layer to build that resilient organization, are there any recommendations that you can do?
I think the biggest, where you see a disparity becoming more and more clear, is that the speed of digital transformation, which got speeded up in the COVID period and now continues in that same trend, is not being met equally or proportionally with the risk management going alongside. So what you're seeing is that companies are moving into a world that doesn't know a boundary, because they're becoming a part of the digital world, which some call cyberspace or whatever name you want to call it. And what you're seeing is that the way we structure policy and regulation is done on a legal basis. The legal basis is always done by country, by international organizations like the EU, then by country, then by organization. In the digital world where Edwin and me are living in, and you're living in as well, there's no boundary, because there is no organization, I think, or maybe one or two, that can survive without actually other sectors, other countries, whether it's a cloud, whether it's a technology provider, whether it's but the regulation and policies are still in that domain. So what you'll see is that the NIS2 makes the same mistake, basically. By dividing it up into sectors, it creates multiple problems. Because the first problem that creates is that many organizations are in multiple sectors. If you take a telecom organization, it can be telecommunications, it can be critical infrastructure, it can be many different situations as well. So there is this that's from a compliance perspective difficult, because that means when you're in multiple sectors, you may have different compliance frameworks. But also, and that's more worryingly, and that's, as a scientist, I'm not allowed to make a prediction, but my prediction, which will be the most difficult paragraph in NIS2, is on risk ownership. And like Edwin said, you need to address the board level as a CISO. But what the NIS2 states is that there shall be one person responsible for carrying the risk, because that's the CEO that carries the liability. And if you look at the article you mentioned in Financial Dagblad, they're aiming for the CEO That's not what the NIS2 says. It says there shall be one owner. Okay, then imagine you're a ministry. Imagine you're an international organization. How can you find and organize yourself into having one risk owner in your legal entity when the digital world is all over the place? Yeah. And that will be the main challenge. The governance part will be the main challenge for any organizations. And that's deep behind what you will find in articles like that.
So basically what I hear you say actually, Raymond, is that traditional governance models, operating models in regards to information security, like the 3 lines of defense model, are you saying that you think that these are no longer effective and we need to change something there in order to optimize that governance in a way that there is that ownership?
I think they're applicable. They're still applicable because that's where you're in the process domain, which is now being reinforced by the NIS2 and compliance. I think the big challenge is applying a 3 lines defense model on all assets within the scope of the NIS2. So having a CMDB, as Edwin already mentioned, that's not the most difficult part. You can find that open source even if you need it or buy it somewhere else. Having a CMDB which correctly makes an inventory on all your assets, OT, IoT, and IT, that's more difficult. So for me, it's not so much as which process, because many of the processes are already there. The problem is the scope in which you apply the process to. And that's where you go into situations where you have OT infrastructure, which doesn't even have an IP address. So how to get it in your CMDB? So for me, it's very much the applicable dimension, which is the challenge, rather than the processes.
Right, okay. Yeah, and so prior to this point, we were talking a little bit already about penalties and that ownership at the top, basically. So how do you look at, if we compare the NIS2 directive with GDPR? Because at first glance, there are some similarities there. So would you think that the penalties enforcement aspect, is that still going to be taken seriously by companies, considering with GDPR, everybody was really scared, but in the end, nothing really happened. Enforcement was actually low. Do we expect that companies are still taking this seriously, and what's different?
I think generally the GDPR can be considered quite successful. I mean, but why is it successful? Because the way it was implemented was quite smart, I think, because it didn't start at the implementation date. It started with a two-year period, coolance period, in order to get your acts together, basically. And the second is that in the end, a regulation becomes effective if it has a penalty, once the first penalty is being handed out. So what you've seen with the GDPR is that currently now many organizations are providing reports to the Autoriteit Persoonsgegevens when they have an incident. There has been some trust going on, and if you now look into the moment GDPR was introduced, the privacy discussion has become normal. When you implement Platformation or Tanium, doing a privacy impact assessment has become normal. And I think with that respect, the NIS2 would be very successful if the measures outlined in the NIS2 would become normal. The difference between the two is that in GDPR, the only one paying the penalty is the company. In NIS2, the penalty is being put in a liability clause to a natural person. And that's the biggest difference, and that will make it much more difficult to actually get litigation going, because the impact of litigation is much worse. This goes beyond the traditional CEO level responsibility of being a good mother or father to the company. Now this is if you as an individual will become liable. Well, if you would become liable in your organization, would you still take the job? Or would you say, well, I don't want that role because that role has a liability in it, I will go for the other one. And what will that do for the people being aware once the first penalty has been handed out, then you'll see a deterrence, like in the US with SolarWinds and the CISO becoming liable by the SEC. So you see this momentum going on, people being held liable instead of accountable.
Yeah. So I would at least, you were asking me the question funnily, but I would definitely at least want to know, am I at risk? Because it could have such a big impact on my life if I would be, a CEO.
Yeah. And there's also urgency, because we are human, so there's always an example needed what can happen when it goes wrong. Yeah, and there is no example that there is a C-level liable and they are going to jail at the moment. When that happens, I will think then the world will be changing. But then they see, hey, there's an example, and we are really responsible. Yeah? We are not in the execution, but we are the owner of this regulation.
Yeah. My number one question to ask to any risk owner, especially at board level, would be to explain to me in his or her terminology, what is your residual risk? Because you will always have a residual risk. And by asking that question, then you basically make the board person you are talking to, you put them on the spot, saying, are you aware enough on your business process to explain to me what still might happen? And that's not an IT question, that's a risk question. But by sort of reversing it, I'm not asking if the person does risk management, no, I'm asking him, so have you heard from your organization what your residual risk is? Because there is always a residual risk. So that means there's always a liability.
Absolutely, yeah. So, and I think that that comes back a little bit also to maybe turning it around, but how do we make those compelling business cases? How do we create that awareness? Dear CEO, dear board member, show me your heat map. Can you clearly articulate, whether you are currently taking risks that you deem intolerable? And for that, I would say, having to start with, a clear pane of glass, basically a complete heat map of the risks across the enterprise would be a good instrument. How do you see that, Edwin?
Yeah, I think we have to learn a lot. Yeah, we as advisories, but also companies with the internal processes. Yeah, so if I take a look at what's happening now, then compliancy is now part of the business. Yeah, it's not a one-off NIS2 and then no, the next one is coming. So I think that is something that needs to be in the DNA of an organization. Yeah, so that's an important part. I think that also prioritization of actions is needed. You cannot do everything in once, but what are the right steps to execute to become more resilient against risk and to be compliant against your regulators? I think if we are in that stage, then we are prepared for the future.
Yeah, so I think you need two dashboards. There is a dashboard on the managing of compliance risk. That means just answering a question, am I compliant to a standard which is applicable to my sector or my industry? And the second is, am I managing my risk? And those two are next to each other. One can be a subset of the other, but managing compliance is something different than managing digital risk.
Very clear to me. Thanks both. Maybe to conclude the session, I would like to both ask you if there is like a top 3 of recommendations, a top 3 call to actions. What would those be, Edwin?
First of all, do the right prioritization. And that is not only actions, but also take a look at your landscape and what is needed. That's one. I think it's also important that you have to take your whole company with you. It's not only the security department and the CISO, it's the whole company. And my third advice is contact us to advise you.
Great, yeah. Thanks so much, Edwin. And Raymond, for you, a top 3 of recommended actions.
I'd say it's 3 words, and I'll explain them shortly. Assets, data, risk. So know your assets according to the scope in the NIS2. So make an inventory, make sure you have them clear. Follow the data, and the data doesn't stay within your company. So for each asset produces data on your organization, on the people in your organizations. And then in the end, when you've done that and basically have assessed the risk from those 2, then you end up with a residual risk.
Good. Very clear. I think with that, I would like to thank both of you, Edwin and Raymond, for this intriguing conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, and have a good day all.